Thing, and my name is Michelle Yun Mapplethorpe. I'm Vice President for Global Artistic Programs and Director of the Asia Society Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Asia Society at the Movies as we continue our new series of film screenings and conversations showcasing a broad range of films and filmmakers from across Asia and the Asian diaspora. As part of this series, Asia Society Museum and Asia Society Southern California are delighted to partner with Asian Cinevisions to profile the documentary Who Killed Vincent Chin in conjunction with AAPI Heritage Month. This Academy Award nominated film from 1987 serves as a powerful statement about racism in America. It recounts the stark facts surrounding the brutal murder of Vincent Chin, a 27-year-old Chinese-American man, at the hands of two white auto workers, Ronald Evans and his stepson, Michael Nitz. In the ensuing trials, both Evans and Nitz were let off with a suspended sentence and a small fine. This outrage over the murder and the lenient sentence for Chin's killers ignited an unprecedented civil rights protest across the Asian American community and led to allyship across racial and ethnic borders. This tragic story addresses pressing social issues, including the failure of the American judicial system to value every citizen's rights equally, the collapse of the automobile industry under pressure from Japanese imports, and the souring of the American dream for the blue-collar worker. Who Killed Vincent Chin remains a crucial document in understanding the evolution of Asian American activism in the United States. Further information about this series, Asia Society at the Movies, may be found through the Asia Society Museum website. We're really pleased to offer this screening and program free of charge and encourage you to take the opportunity to make a small donation when you register to support Asia Society's programming. This evening's program features an in-depth conversation between artists and activists Kenneth Tam and Siyan Wong, using Who Killed Vincent Chin as a point of departure to examine the present scourge of discrimination and violence against the Asian American community and to discuss how we may affect sustainable systemic change going forward. At this time, it's my pleasure to introduce my special guest this evening. Kenneth Tam is a Brooklyn-based artist who works in video, sculpture, and photography. His latest solo exhibition, Silent Spikes, is on view at the Queens Museum, New York, through June 23, 2021. This show explores intersections of gender, performance, race, and labor economics connected to the building of the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad. The video will be presented at the Institute of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles in June. Tam will present a newly commissioned work as part of Open Call at the Shed, New York, on view this summer in 2021. He's participated in numerous group shows and residencies and held solo exhibitions at the Kitchen at Queens Lab, the Gallery at Humboldt-Sarah Lawrence College, Minneapolis Institute of Art, the MIT List Center for Visual Arts, Commonwealth and Council Los Angeles, and the Night Gallery, also in Los Angeles. He's the recipient of a Foundation for Contemporary Arts Emergency Grant, the California Community Foundation Fellowship, and Art Matters Foundation Grant. Tam is currently a lecturer in visual arts at Princeton University, and he's also involved in Stop Discrimination, a coalition of workers within arts and culture who are confronting racism, xenophobia, and violence towards diasporic Asians that have been amplified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Siyan Wong. Wong is a New York-based visual artist whose work focuses on the working poor, the homeless, women, and the elderly. She's a first-generation immigrant who was born in China but raised in New York City. Wong acquired her art fundamentals at LaGuardia High School of Music, Art and Performing Arts, and though she went on to study history and economics in college, and then attended law school, she always took art classes alongside her academic studies. In 2000, Wong began working as a workers' rights lawyer, and since 2018, she has shown her paintings at the New York Artists Equity Association, the New York Art Center, and has spoken about her work at many organizations, including at the Museum of Chinese in the America and other venues. As a workers' rights lawyer, her contact with everyday working people informs her empathy and artistic vision. Wong's immigrant roots and her encounters as an Asian American woman in the United States illuminate her visual interests, and her work is supported by the Asian Women's Giving Circle and the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. So before we begin, I'll preface the conversation just by noting that the AAPI community has long been used as a scapegoat in this country since the mid-19th century, really beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 through legislation. And so in light of the recent wave of racism and violence that has been directed towards the Asian American community, Asia Society wanted to raise awareness of this other moment in the country's recent past, the case of Vincent Chin, where Asian Americans were wrongfully targeted. And so, I really see this as a cautionary tale of how this moment, in the 80s that galvanized the Asian American community and engendered great allyship across disparate communities has largely been forgotten, and really want to take this opportunity to examine the present situation, discuss how we can learn from the past and to figure out how we can really affect sustainable change going forward. So please join me in welcoming Siyan and Ken to our conversation this evening. Thank you both for taking the time to speak with me tonight. I would really value from from both of your respective experiences as artists and as activists, to really think about this current moment where we are, and what's going on with the Asian American community, and how we can maybe come up with some solutions or thinking about how we can affect real change going forward. So I guess, maybe just to use the documentary as a starting off point, if you could, from your respective experiences, just give a little bit of background on how you heard about the Vincent Chin case, and, how it affected you in your lives. And if you find similarities to the circumstances, of that murder and where we are now. I mean, I think obviously there was a very particular moment, but I think, with the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic and Asians being used as scapegoats, I think there are certain parallels between, societal feelings towards the Asian American community. So, Ken, do you want to start off?
Sure. Thank you, Michelle, for this invitation to speak. And I guess trying to remember when exactly the story, the murder of Vincent Chin, first appeared to me. And I don't have a specific date or moment that I can recall, but certainly I think that that case, I learned about it probably in some sort of research about Asian American history or recent Asian American history. And I think when I did read about it for the first time, it was obviously horrific, and a really shocking moment to read about. It happened in 1982, actually the year that I was born. So there was that particular resonance, something that certainly, my parents obviously never talked about, and perhaps were not even aware of. So it's a history that was quite significant in the moment that it happened, but perhaps, a lot of people may not even know about it, especially recent immigrants. So I think, there is that sort of a knowledge gap. But yeah, learning about it was a really difficult thing to sort of understand and unpack. And I think in terms of how it compares to our present situation, while I think there are many similarities, certainly in terms of the response and the sort of coalitional response that Asian Americans have, been coming together and organizing in the past year. Similarly in the response to the Vincent Chin case, I think there are also a number of significant differences between what happened to him and what's happening to the Asian American community at large right now. In that instance, it was very clear who the perpetrators were. Today, it's not so clear, right? It seems to be happening everywhere simultaneously. The victims are also a bit different. Vincent Chin was a Chinese American male auto worker. So perhaps the racial animus was also tied to an economic disenfranchisement. But today, it's certainly COVID and political speech has activated it, but it seems to be perhaps much larger than that. Also, the kinds of people that are being targeted today, you see that it's a lot of the attacks are, while everyone is experiencing them, the most horrific ones seem to be towards the elderly and elderly women. So there is, perhaps the more vulnerable members of our community are the ones that are the most susceptible right now. So it adds a different degree of fear, even terror that is constant, right? There's already so many things that we're worried about and fearful of right now, but this just adds another layer to that sort of constant sense of threat, let's say. So, I don't want to go too much longer, but I think those are the main differences that I see right now between what happened almost 40 years ago and what's happening today.
Sure. Thank you, Ken. And I want to definitely circle back to some of the points that you raised. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, Siyan, about, how you first experienced the story and how it affected you, and your maybe some contextualizing thoughts about the case as it pertains to the present moment.
Thank you for having me. I actually first came across this documentary when I was in college. And it was just pure accidents. It wasn't because I was taking a class. I was on the floor as a resident assistant, and I wanted to show a film to the residents on the floor, and we can all enjoy and talk about it. So I thought I would just go into the history of Asian Americans or Black history or whatnot. And I just came across this movie and I showed it. And it was not what I expected. It was a shock. And it was actually that documentary that made me realize I need to learn what it means to be someone who looked like me in America. Going to college, I identify myself as Chinese and immigrant at best, right? And that I was American because I was growing up and learning, educating in the US. But after watching the movie, I wanted to understand what it means to be Asian American. Because I think it is, Vincent Chin's killing is one of those real life events that wake you up to take a hot look at the society that you actually live in and not the one that you think you live in. Growing up as children in school, we all learn, we all have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness and justice for all. And it's not something as children that we're not taught. I mean, that's just what's taught in school. And even my children now, they are taught that, right? And I'm no exception. And that case really changed the way I begin to see what justice is. And that was before I decided I should go to law school. And I think that filmmaker Christine Choi and Renee Tajima, Pina, the directors of Who Killed Vincent Chin, for naming the film Who Killed Vincent Chin, because we know that, yes, it was two men, white male, who decided to just, it wasn't a ball fight the way it was described. If we look at the facts, there was a fight, and but Evans and his stepson actually chased after Vincent Chin from the bar to the streets, couldn't get him on the streets, got back into their car and chased him all the way to McDonald's. And it was there that they were able to corner him, got the baseball bat out, and did what they did. That if they were drunk, they weren't that drunk at that point. They were able to drive and swing the bat and aim pretty well. And it is such a stark injustice. The fact was so clear, and yet the result of the case was so shocking to the conscience. And in the film, we saw the contrast. How white folks saw it very differently than minorities, and that was. I'm sure anyone who had just watched the film, who had watched the film before, and even if you're not Asian or minorities, it does tell you something. It's the sense of injustice that happened in that case, and it galvanized America. So I think that now looking at it as a lawyer, after 21 years of litigating and watching it again, it lends to show why at the time the Asian community needed to argue that this was a hate crime. First, they had to do it because there's no second jeopardy, right? You can't try the same person for the same crime twice. So they had to look at another statute and another system, and they went to the federal system, and they have to argue that this was a hate crime. I hope that's not surprising, and had Vincent Chin not been Asian, I wonder, and I think we can all wonder, whether or not the same result would have happened. I think the answer was no. And that's why the community felt the need to take it further. Had there been justice, I don't think Vincent Chin's mother would have gone through the pain to go all the way, to live her last days trying to fight for justice. Had the man been sentenced correctly and not 3 months, I don't think the Asian community would have been that angry. I don't think that it would have awakened the community that much. And I think, Vincent Chin's case shows us that it's a reminder of the similar injustice that the African-American community is facing, and many minorities. There's the Vincent Chin's case that is so stark. And then, there's the George Floyd that is so stark. And thanks to the videos that we have today, it's recorded and it's the facts are the facts. People see with their own eyes. And I think that, probably there was a lot more anti-Asian violence back in the 80s when the American automakers just simply could not compete with the Japanese automakers. And it was devastating, right? In the US, education really wasn't so diverse in learning about different people coming from different places. Many people were angry. They're losing their livelihood, right? And it's very easy to blame. It's very easy to take it out on other people. And we see the same thing today, the scapegoating that goes on. The pandemic is blamed on Asians, and all of a sudden all Asians are now Chinese for some reason. And that itself should be shocking. that people don't draw a distinction between Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Vietnamese, Malaysian, Indonesian. The world is very big. And yet, in America, racism had reduced the diversity of people and their backgrounds and their culture to just
reducing it to
very small. So I think that the scapegoating tells Americans more about Americans than anything else. And I think that we must change the way people think, and otherizing, putting people as others, minimize their human worth. And that's really what we're seeing when we see racism.
No, I think that's a great point. And I think, I would be curious, Ken, from your perspective, because, I think largely in response to the discrimination that arose because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you and others in the art field created discrimination. And I wonder, through that advocacy work, and I know early on, I believe you had circulated a Google Doc where people could, share their stories of, acts that had been committed against them or that they had witnessed. And so I wonder, to Siyan's point that, through these certain moments, people get so reduced to just this kind of very linear perspective or, observation of who they are. I mean, could you maybe share a little bit of your experience seeing that through your advocacy work?
Yeah, sure. So I'm working with a group of Asian American diasporic art workers, Stop Discrimination, and we came together shortly after the lockdown of last year, and it was a direct consequence of the increasing harassment that was being directed towards Asian Americans, either at some of our members directly or through stories that we were hearing. And part of that came about through this Google Doc, as you mentioned, that I had started circulating after a close friend of mine who lives in the same neighborhood that I live in Brooklyn, shared with me some of her firsthand experiences very early on in the pandemic in early March. And it was quite shocking. I knew that these kinds of things were going to start happening. I knew that, people that were Chinese or, looked a certain way would start feeling the consequences of what was happening in Wuhan at the time, right? Back in January and February. I didn't quite understand that it was happening with people that I knew, that I cared about in the same neighborhood that I lived in. And she told me, two separate incidents, which were I felt quite distressing. They weren't simple little passing kind of comments. They were things that really singled her out as an individual, as a kind of surrogate for disease, right? And so that really shocked me and started me on a path to want to do something. Not that I had any specific answers, or I wouldn't even call myself an activist. It just given what little I had was able to do from my home, I thought just perhaps sharing or soliciting others for their experiences and sharing that could be very helpful. There is a history of within the Asian American community of minimizing such events, right? We've all experienced some of these things at some point in our lives, but we don't really ever talk about it. And I thought it would be helpful to try to connect these things and certainly educate myself about what was happening, but also my peers. So that was, that was a document that I shared with people in the art community, but with the express intention of it going further as far as possible. And from there, I in a group of arts workers from New York, Los Angeles, and the Bay Area got together and formed this group, Stop Discrimination, or SDA. And I think that we're certainly not the only ones that have sort of been born from this past year's incidents, one of the things that we're constantly doing as part of our activism is learning, right? There's so much that we didn't know at the very beginning. I feel like, understanding what actual activists have been doing for many, many years on the ground has been so much a part of what we've been trying to do, and to sort of disseminate that knowledge to those within our immediate professional community, let's say, of other arts workers. So that I feel like that's something that we're constantly negotiating, understanding what's already been done, what others are doing, and how we, within with our particular skill sets and our, what leverage that we have, how can we sort of move the needle in this conversation? So perhaps, something like Vincent Chin, it's not something that we talk about often, but that is part of the history, that is part of the larger history of Asian Americans in this country that one has to contend with. And it's important to sort of see all of these incidents on some kind of spectrum, that it's not just this year, it's not last year, it's much, much longer. One of the things that's important to realize is that while perhaps the larger Asian American community is feeling under threat, there are groups that have always been under threat, right? Recent immigrants, the elderly, the poor, these things have been happening to them for a very long time, and we never paid attention to it. And by we, I mean the Asian American community that, perhaps is watching this talk right now, right? The ones that are, are privileged enough not to have to worry about that, right? We don't have to think of ourselves as vulnerable in that way, either through class, occupation, other factors. And it's important to recognize that this problem didn't start with COVID, and it's not going to end with, a new administration, let's say. It's important to recognize how class is a big determining factor in our vulnerability. And there are certain people who are going to be, again, much more susceptible, just like everything, just like how COVID has revealed, all of these sort of inequities. It's also true of the sort of anti-Asian American harassment, that certain groups are going to be much more susceptible. And it's important to recognize that in our activism.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see, because I wholeheartedly agree that it's so much more nuanced, I think, and that there certainly are more vulnerable communities within the Asian American community. I mean, and I guess for both of you, do you have thoughts about how we can better advocate or protect those more vulnerable communities, either whether the elderly or those who are, kind of in the lower, new immigrants, or those that are, kind of not able to shield themselves, through monetary means, or, by other elements. Any thoughts on that? How to be a better advocate from where we sit, I guess, and maybe through your artwork as well. I mean, we can talk a little bit about, I think with Silent Spike, you are talking about that continuum, Ken, through, the work of, the Chinese railroad workers in the 19th century. I mean, kind of showing that vulnerability and that continuum. And so, if you want to
I mean, it's complicated, even this term of Asian American, I feel like, is a very coalitional identity, right? It doesn't necessarily map onto very clear boundaries in terms of identity. And so even that, because of that, I think that very often we think that, what happens to one group may not matter to another, right? Within larger Asian America, or what happens in one part of history is not relevant to the present. And so yeah, one of the things I was trying to do in that video was to kind of, draw out these lines, make some of these connections, and not to say that, every Asian American person needs to, or the struggles that Asian Americans are facing now are the same as what happened 150 years ago with recent, immigrant laborers. But there is something to be learned, and to kind of understanding that these struggles are ever present. It's important to kind of keep that in mind in all of our sort of activism. Again, regardless of who's in power, or if it's sort of an economically driven racial animus in one generation versus something that's related to the pandemic in this one. In answer to your question about how one could protect protect these more vulnerable populations, I think there are a lot of grassroots organizations that are doing that kind of work. I mean, I think that's something to be really important and mindful of, and especially since another distinction between what happened with Vincent Chin and what's happening today is that these crimes, these attacks, are happening within these Asian communities themselves, right? I don't exactly know where in Detroit Vincent Chin was murdered, but we are seeing these attacks happening on, let's say, our doorsteps, or where we go shopping for food, or where the elderly population is living. These aren't in far-flung areas with small Asian populations. These are happening right at the heart of all the diaspora communities in this country. So, we are near, proximity, we are quite close to these vulnerable populations. And it's important to recognize that and to be aware of that. And to work with the organizations that already exist and have been doing that kind of work for quite a long time, to support them.
Sure. I mean, and Siyan, I think in your legal practice, you have been, very directly an advocate for many in these more vulnerable communities. I think both in your legal work, but also in your artistic practice as well, focusing on the garment workers, focusing on the canners. I mean, if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, both within, respectively, your artistic and your legal practice, how you feel that you can amplify their voices and what you might recommend to better support these communities from your perspective and your experience.
I think to answer your very direct question, how can we support these more vulnerable communities? Is that we just have to be there to do something, and second, really, within our power, to raise awareness of that this is happening. One is, very practically, there are a lot of bystander trainings that are available online. And I think that we can all learn to be better bystanders, to de-escalate a situation instead of moving away when you see something about to happen on the train or on the streets. If you're in a position of power, in this instance, if you're not Asian and you're not elderly, try to step in. As long as it's not, somebody's not wielding a gun or a knife. If you can step in, attempt to do so. And I think, the Asian American community, particularly the elderlies and the women, need to be more vigilant because, elderlies and women were the primary targets. So more specifically, I think bystander trainings, if people can really see themselves in a more active role as a bystander, that would be very helpful. On the more long term, I can say that, I decided that being a workers' rights lawyer and particularly on the side of workers is what I wanted to do because, I came from the working class. My parents worked hard and they were very committed to doing their job as parents and raising children, that I want to make sure that I'm there to protect workers and their rights to better their lives through work. So I've been a litigator for 21 years and my focus really shifted to wanting to focus on the arts because it started with me getting to know an elderly canner who collect cans in my neighborhood. And she told me that she used to work in a garment factory, that she had 4 children, and that she was, at the time when she told me, she was 93 years old. I was just shocked that at 93, she had been canning and I've been seeing her in the neighborhood for a number of years. And that really got me to think there's something really wrong with this picture. And I got to know other canners in the neighborhood, and I realized that if they were Chinese, they worked in the garment factory. And by the 2010, 2011, most of the garment factories left Chinatown and left Brooklyn and left Queens. There's still some left, but by no means employing 150,000 garment workers like it was at one point. That was the economic strength of this community, right? For families, for opportunities, for owning a home, for having a stable home, sending your kids to college, all that left. And I wanted to raise awareness. I wanted people to see these women and see who they are as people. So I did a 5 cents a can exhibition, making visible the invisible. Then now I'm working on another series called Remembering Our History, and that traced the employment of specifically Chinese immigrant women from about 1965 to the present. And I'm working on between 30 and 50 paintings to tell that story. Because I think that when people are aware of the human spirit, the perseverance of hard work, long hours, and then the resilience of these women to continue to work and survive and be a part of society the best that they can, I think people will hopefully realize one, my generation, children of that older generation, we want to really explore political power and what it means for immigrants. And we also want to understand injustice now that we have the power to do something about it. And that there's nothing more rewarding than to see that as humans that we treat each other fairly. And I think that for me, because the Asian American story is so absent, particularly I think in paintings from the art world still. There are many artists, including Kenneth and many others, but I think it's still lacking. I think and the immigrant stories that I'm interested in about elderlies and women, that story is missing in the arts, and my goal is to share their story, because if it's not recorded, it never happened. And I'm really inspired by the perseverance and the kindness in this woman, and because I see myself in them, and I think that I want to definitely keep their history. Now, there is an issue of class, right? There are always the so-called, Professor Peter Kwan would say, the uptown Chinese versus the immigrant Chinese, right? Or the poor Asian American versus the professional middle class, Asians. I think we ultimately all come back to our roots. And I think the current violence against people who look like us shows us that, you can never escape injustice. I think it should be a part of all of us to try to find justice, and I guess my feeling that we never have enough, right? So having things and achieving a certain status really, I guess, doesn't mean all that much to me at the end of the day. And I think to many of us, and I think there's this pandemic is causing this sort of awakening too, that there are other things that are so much more, excuse me, important than the stuff we have, the status that we have.
I think, Siyan, you hit on a good point in terms of representation and agency, right? And I think that because this issue of race and equality can still be such a charged point. And I think sometimes, you know, as we've seen in other instances, like people have become very siloed and kind of talking within their own bubble. And I think that art is a really powerful and visceral way to kind of allow representation and agency, but also to really convey issues of injustice, or to convey, you know, points of view that maybe people would be more accepting than if somebody had a direct conversation. And I wonder, for both of you, maybe we can go back to you for a moment, Ken, you know, in terms of, you know, you had a very kind of deep and I think broad dialogue with the arts community. And I wonder if people's practices and the way that they felt that they could express what they were feeling and what people were going through, you know, you included, evolved over the past year, you know, through this kind of more sustained experience of discrimination or injustice. And I wonder if you see real differences in the way that, you know, those in the Asian American community are expressing these ideas through their artistic practices.
That's an interesting question. I mean, you know, within, I don't know if there's necessarily like artists making artwork, you know, in response to this, in response to, you know, the past year's incidents. I'm sure there are people that are working on things like that. You know, even the projects that I've been exhibiting in the past, right now, and in the past year, they do touch on issues of Asian American identity and how violence operates. But these were things I was thinking about, you know, years ago, you know, the pre-pandemic. But I think that goes to show that, you know, maybe the kind of artistic production that you're talking about that addresses these issues have been doing so for longer, or again, like looking at this through a wider lens. And, you know, perhaps it's important to kind of revisit those artists and see, you know, what their production in the past can teach us, you know, today. I know that for Stop Discrimination, you know, a lot of our advocacy, while we do try to promote, you know, use the language of visual art to talk about these attacks, we're also very interested in advocating for arts workers working, you know, within various institutions, let's say, and giving them a voice. You know, we've been hearing through our advocacy how often they become marginalized, and not necessarily victims or targets of outright racism, but there are certain things that happen within these institutional models that also need to be addressed, that are longstanding, that perhaps are not direct consequences of the pandemic, but certainly tie into larger histories of anti-Asian racism, perhaps in much more subtle ways, right? So that's something that we're shifting towards and trying to pay attention to as well. These more nuanced, say, racisms against Asian Americans that don't have to result, you know, that don't require a physical violence to still be traumatizing, or yeah, you know, that's something that we're attuned to, just because, you know, there are so many organizations that are on the ground, and, you know, we don't have that kind of capacity. We're very conscious of what we can or can't do, and how we want to support others who have that kind of experience, or that kind of that proficiency that, again, we know we can only do so much within our sort of professional class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, capacity.
And I guess then that brings the issue of allyship, right? I mean, and I think you're very right, Ken, that I think people are really, you know, the scales are coming off of their eyes and they're seeing what the issues are. And I think it's become more prevalent because of the volume and kind of the severity of maybe the acts that are being committed against Asian Americans, but it's certainly not isolated to this particular moment. And so, you know, I guess that leads me to my next question to both of you. It's like, how can we envision and implement real change, real systemic change that, I think in the 80s with Vincent Chin, people were galvanized. They really wanted to make change. Like they felt like they were really making a difference. And in fact, there were some changes, contributed to the anti-hate crimes law, and so there was some change and some legislative amendments that happened as a result of that. But, how can we use that as a cautionary tale and avoid kind of having this be another blip? And, everybody is very fired up now, but then, when the next issue comes or whatever, then people get tired, and then they lose momentum, and then, nothing really changes. How do we move past that, I guess? What would your recommendations be, or how do you see that we can really make change for the better?
I'll take a stab at that. I think a systemic problem require a systemic solution. And I think what you're talking about is, obviously, racism is long and deep in this country. And it's going to take more than one day, a week, or a year for that to change. It has taken the African American community for so many years, and they're still trying to make change. And we can certainly, as the Asian American community, continue to learn from their activism. And I think that some of the things that we can do, first as artists, we can sustain this conversation by creating art that continue to help people learn about how, get to know Asian Americans, who we are, our issues, our American experience, and to always see ourselves as Americans, because we are American. I like to see myself first as American before I'm Chinese American, because of the way I think, the work that I do, the food that I eat, the places I go to, the things that I find interesting. I'm really first and foremost American, because when I go to China, they call me American because of the way I think, the way I talk, the things I'm interested in, right? So that's I think as artists, that's something that we can do. So I started the Asian American Portraits Project, where I'm just painting Asian Americans of all different walks of life. And that I started January 2021, precisely to, I know change takes time, and rushing at it, it doesn't really help. I think we need to take the long-term view. The other thing that more systematic that I would like to see happen is that while we push for policy change, which we're just waiting for the House now to come back with the law against anti-Asian violence, right? And so that Biden can sign it. That is so critical. We need to push for legislations. But also more importantly, we need judges who are Asian Americans, who are diverse, who understand, diverse in class, in life experience, to get to the bench. We also need to have in the criminal justice system people who look like the people that they would have to arrest. So that is very important. I think the Asian American population in the New York City police force is still not representative. That's my understanding. I think there is slow change. I don't know at what stage it is now. And then obviously the whole the training in the force needs to really be scrutinized. And then in our education system, now there's a huge push for having Asian American history in history books. That labor history, which is also absent in the history books, African American history, I don't know how much that is in the history book. My children went to a school that had a full curriculum on African American history, so that was good for them. But there is still no Asian American history. And we see a lot of actually, violence against Asians by teenage Black kids. And I attribute that to a systemic problem. It's just really, we need change. And I'm now in conversation with an African American artist, a good friend, and we're talking about this problem openly. And that conversations, I think, among friends and our colleagues and the broader circle that we're in, and really confronting those issues can move people ahead. And so he and I are talking about it. I said, like, why is it that, I asked him, why is it that there's so much anti-Asian violence by, the Black community against the Asian community, and I say a lot because that's what I see on social media, that it's recorded. And I'm sure there are many others, but I'm seeing this and it's really troubling to me. And he said, because Asian Americans in the eyes of many are like sometimes white and sometimes minority, right? Somehow our identity is defined by others. We're kind of shifted. So we're sort of white, and why is that? I think we as a community, we need to look into that. But as artists, he and I are talking about collaborating on an exhibition to really examine this from his perspective, from my perspective, on this issue. So that's all very exciting. So I think, Michelle, to your question, it is for a systemic problem, we do need to take a long view, and it's hard work, is perseverance, and resilience. And a crisis presents an opportunity. And I hope that, I think that's what art can do to sustain this conversation, to inspire this, like you said, art is a space that is not confrontational. It could be, you can look at a painting, you can look at an installation, a film, and really absorb it at the weight that you need to process what needs to, change in the way you think. So I think that as artists, we can do that. And as Asian Americans, we can help push for policy changes that will really result in long-term systemic change, not just for Asian Americans, but for all people. Because, if there's no justice for one, there's no justice for all.
Mm-hmm. No, very well said. And I guess, Ken, from your perspective, you mentioning, that there needs to be systemic change within arts, and through, kind of the art structure. I mean, do you have any recommendations in terms of, how we can champion, younger professionals? I think from my perspective and your perspective of, as those who are more established in the arts, how can we champion this younger generation and kind of assure that there is broader representation in the field, both for artists and for arts professionals, that we can, amplify our voice?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there is definitely a lot within the arts field that can be done. Like you said, I think curators or other people in positions of power should understand how they can wield their power to have particular kinds of conversations, right? To focus on issues that perhaps have not had enough attention, to perhaps center Asian American voices, to realize that they can, that their positions and their visibility can empower the community and start very, specific conversations that we need to have, like the ones that you mentioned. I think, part of what we're trying to do in SDA is to galvanize those in our field to feel like they can do that, right? Instead of just sort of feeling that invisible or that they're marginal, to sort of see how they can find their voice within institutions that often, make those voices marginal. That's one of the conversations that we're trying to have, because, we understand, perhaps 20 or 30 years ago, the conversation within Asian American arts workers, like, okay, how do we get people into our field in general? How do we get Asian Americans in museums exhibiting, but also working in administrative or curatorial capacity? That was a challenge for that generation. I think, 30 years later, we're seeing the fruits of that work, and there are a lot of Asian Americans working throughout the arts, but how can we continue to build on that progress and not just fight for representational change, but also how do we change the fundamental power structures within these institutions to give all marginalized voices space and to center all of their struggles. Because so much, I think, what really needs to happen, and I agree with Siyan about easy solutions, part of the long-term things that we must do as an Asian American community is to build solidarity with all communities of color. And, I just want to push back a little bit about, working with the police. And I think that, for SDA and other perhaps more progressive groups, we're very sort of hesitant to, or downright opposed to increasing the involvement of the police and communities of color. We already know the sort of traumatic effect that's had in constantly. And so we don't want that to be a solution. I think we advocate for more grassroots solutions, talking to people, talking to other communities and building solidarities in that way versus inviting more, carceral or surveillance type activities. I think that's the future that we want to build in order to combat all forms of discrimination and violence based on race.
No, thank you. Very well said. I mean, and very noble in its pursuits. I really want to thank both of you for your time. Our time to converse is quickly coming to an end, but I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and hopefully have come up with some recommendations for the way forward, to really be thoughtful and to be more empathetic, not just within kind of the nuances of the Asian American community, but beyond, and to really kind of form coalitions and meaningful relationships and dialogues with others. So I don't know if either of you have any parting thoughts that you want to share with the audience before we sign off, but I'll give you the floor.
I agree with Ken that our current police state is very problematic, including the support for all these jails. I think the investment of our money is in the wrong direction. It will only perpetuate a systemic racist society if we continue to invest so much money in the police state and in jails, because it doesn't invest in the people who are growing up. If people in the minority communities are growing up, or just the poor communities growing up looking at jails, that's where they'll end up. That's not inspirational. I think people,
demoralizing.
Right. And I think that so I'm against the jails. I think that we in our generation, we need to think creatively and responsibly in solving the problems that we have today. And I would prefer my tax dollars, and I think many would agree, to investing in our children rather than in jails, opportunities not to go to jail, but to have a better life. So there's a lot of problems. And I think I agree with Ken that there are people who are working in this area. We need to provide support for them to further their work, because we don't want to, lose our resources, by creating something new when there are already people working in this area. So I agree with that. And I also want to say as a last point that we need to hold our own responsible when they don't act in the interest of our community and act in the interest of justice. And I think that is very important. That's not infighting, like some people say. That is really looking at ourselves as human beings first before we start going into this identity you know, so I would like all of us to think about that, in light of the Vincent Chin killing.
Thank you, Sian. Any last thoughts, Ken?
Yeah, maybe I'll just say that, I encourage everyone to speak up about these issues. I didn't think I would be in this position a year and a half ago, but here I am. And, I just think that the more conversations we have, the better. I think that there are some very complex and perhaps even difficult conversations we need to have, but I think it's important to have them and to kind of further that dialogue within our communities and in tandem with other ones. This issue will not go away anytime soon. I think that if we really truly care about taking an anti-racist position, then we need to really dig in and be prepared for a much longer period of activism, or organization, if we really want to see change happen.
Great. No, thank you. I mean, thank you both for your generosity of time and for your thoughts. Both of your practices are so admirable. And I look forward to continuing our discussion together. And thank you so much for being here and sharing your heartfelt ideas and thoughts for the way forward. So thank you so much for joining me. I thank all of you who are out there tuning in for joining us. And please, as Ken and Sienna are saying, continue this conversation with your friends and your colleagues. And we'll work together to bring a more equitable and just world. So wishing everybody a good night. And I'll see you again, hopefully soon at the movies at Asia Society. And thank you so much. All right. Take care, everybody.